difference, we make it clear.
Welcome to the Space Power Podcast, the official podcast of the Space Force Association, where we highlight the people and ideas shaping the future of U.S. space power. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, and today I'm honored to be joined by retired Colonel Keith Balts, retired from the United States Air Force after more than 3 decades of service. Colonel, and should I say Dr. Baltz's career spanned critical leadership roles in space operations, including serving as commander of the 30th Space Wing at Vandenberg Air Force Base, director of Space Forces for U.S. Air Force's Central Command, and contributing to missions such as Operation Burnt Frost. He's now bringing his experience into academia, teaching at Clemson University and conducting groundbreaking research in space operations education. Colonel Balts, welcome to the show. It's a real honor to have you here.
Hey, Bill, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start from the very beginning. I read that your passion for space started at just 11 years old during a family visit to Cape Canaveral. What stood out to you in that moment, and how did it shape your aspirations?
Well, a couple things. One is pretty cliche. I'll grant you that. And also, it was over 40 years ago. So I just think as I look back on that, just the awe and wonder, we all see that, especially with the space launch missions, which wasn't really part of my Air Force career until much later, really at the end of the career. But there's just a lot of technology there. My dad was a STEM educator back in the day, and so he wasn't into space, but he could make that connection. So I saw his excitement about it, which I'm sure excited me as a young kid. So anyway, just a fascination like we see a lot surrounding our launch pads and just space capabilities wherever you get connected to them.
Yeah, like many people, they see the capabilities out there and they get excited, and then they figure out, hey, how do I start my career in that? So, fast forwarding now, you decide to join ROTC and commission to the Air Force. What drew you to that path, and what were your expectations entering active duty?
Yeah, so I did come from a military family. My dad served very briefly long before I was born. So the ROTC scholarships, which is how we attract talent to the military, frankly. While that scholarship path is changing nowadays, back in the day, that's what attracted me to at least start. Of course, once I got into college and that environment, that culture of simultaneously your fraternity, your co-op, your internship, all those things, and felt very familiar to me from my sports and scouting background as a youth. And so I said, hey, I'm gonna stick with it, give it a go, and do my what I thought would be 4 years, maybe get into space or do whatever the Air Force needed me to do, and just really loved it. As far as expectations goes, I think it's hard to look back. I know what I was to expect. I hope that just translated from what I felt in college to that teamwork, that travel opportunity, sense of purpose would translate into post education life, and by and large, it did. Right, that's what kept me staying for I guess 28 years on active duty.
Now, early in your career, and it's, you bring this up, and remember, we came from that time when there wasn't a very clear space career path. You had the missileers, and then you had the space professionals, and then ultimately they opened up the missile track so that folks can move from missiles into space operations. But you're one of those ones that kind of started out early in your career where space operations were still relatively new territory. What were some of the biggest uncertainties or challenges you faced when you stepped into that world?
One, I was looking for structure because I was new to the Air Force. I was young, trying to plug in, but things were changing so fast. It's dynamic, which is both, I think, both exciting but also frustrating, right? Especially if, with my background, I'm looking for structure to see where I can fit in and then maybe make an impact. So the technologies are changing, the organizations were changing. So I think that was the biggest challenge. And back then and even now, trying to connect it to the military version of space operations, trying to create a sense of warrior ethos. I mean, I was in the military for crying out loud. So much of what we were doing felt corporate, felt just based on technology, felt engineering based, which was important. It was hard back then, and I think may still be a challenge today to plug that into war fighting, warrior ethos, offense, defense, intel, all those things that we appreciate in the other mediums of warfare. We're still trying to figure that out. That whole Space Force enhancement eventually morphed into or became a necessity to protect and take that capability away from others. And so that was the challenge, at least as I was trying to navigate my own naivety in that environment as a young officer.
You bring up a point. Remember, when we were growing up in the Air Force as space weapons officers, we'd always talk about the supporting roles where we'd always talk about, well, space is a supporting entity to the other domains. And now we're talking about space is being supported by the other domains to ensure space superiority can be met. That's a pretty dynamic shift.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, we sort of studied our own military history even before the Space Force or Air Force, that dichotomy between air forces and support to ground forces until they became a supported medium in several small and large conflicts over the years, and getting the other services because we are organized by medium, if you will. They have to understand a little bit of it, right? Even pilots have to understand the ground, ships at sea have to understand the air, and the Marines, of course, are transition between the both. Same thing I saw in the early days of Space Force. We're trying to understand the other mediums so we could, frankly, work together as a diverse fighting force, right? Joint force. And we are trying to figure out our lexicon, our words, our capabilities. So internally, let alone finding ways through space weapons officers or the old space support teams, which I was a part of, just educating and creating a common language to use so then we could then get past the foundational stuff and actually apply it when needed in either direction, right? Supporting or eventually maybe even supported if that's where the conflict was going to occur.
And sir, you served from 92 to 2020, a period of extraordinary evolution in space operations. What are the three of the biggest changes you witnessed during that time?
Yeah, I think we hit on it. That transition from not supported supporting, but the force enhancement, which was clearly supporting, to realize that we need to have a defense in space to protect these capabilities that we're now providing because we're now in a contested domain. Uh, Potentially the offensive use of that in the right environments and at the right time. And then, frankly, the biggest one, just like I think in this information age and other mediums too, you need an intelligence infrastructure to get the information you need to enable and protect those capabilities. And so that one, I think, we're still trying to figure out space intelligence or intelligence, not from space. Of course, we've always had that with the launch of NRO satellites, but intelligence for space to do those offensive and defensive operations are the things that I kind of witnessed and been in and out of theaters, in and out of jobs during my career that we're learning the same lessons over and over again and never evolved past it, or we have in some areas. So it's exciting to be a part. And then just to apply it beyond the engineering and the corporate side of the technology and actually applying it in a supported or supporting role, like we keep mentioning.
Yeah, I can't help, and we're going to talk probably a little bit about this. Whenever you talk about air components and the air coordination plan, you can't help but then start talking about, okay, what is the space coordination plan? What are the assets that are available to the Space Force component to ensure freedom of action in domain, whether it's U.S. Space Command conducting that mission, or whether it's another combatant command working with U.S. Space Command to ensure freedom of action in domain. I mean, we're not going to solve it today, but just curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that just again trying to learn each other's side. Not that it's a negotiation because we're not adversaries to each other. Heck, we're on the same joint team, but you have to appreciate where the other side is coming from. And I appreciate the opportunity to get into theater through my space weapons officer track and deployments, which I think I was thirsty for. Part of what I said in my early part of my career, trying to understand how this applied to the military, helping make those translations or understand how that worked. And it's okay. The capabilities were important, but they weren't as ubiquitous or as forceful, or the necessary offense and defense wasn't there. So we were doing these things on, as you know, with some of our wingmen here, doing them on sheets of paper, spreadsheets. We didn't have the systems, the information systems, the databases yet, but the functions were still there. We were just doing it on a thin on the cheap because that's where we were in our evolution, and that's okay, right? Today, of course, the capabilities are bigger. The operations have obviously a much bigger effect or impact. And so with that has come hopefully not just the human element that has evolved and gotten thicker, if you will, uh, but our processes, procedures, and organizations are stronger to support that growth. So it's fun back then.
Definitely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Sir, as commander of the 30th Space Wing at Vandenberg, you oversaw launch operations and range safety. Can you share a high pressure moment from that role and how your team handled it?
Yeah, I mean, every launch I think is high pressure, so I can't go through all of them. Thankfully, they were all successful, both in my vice commander and commander time there, doing launch much later in my career, delivering capability, not just using it or operating it. In the launch business, we had a power outage right before an NRO launch, so the team had to fight through that and take on years of risk that were manifested in our fragile power grid out there, which you need propulsion, fuel to launch rockets, but you also need electricity, right? So that was an exciting time. The first Delta IV Heavy out there and the loss of a key radar, we need to track the vehicle coming off the pad because our job there was to crack it if it was going off course and protect the people. So we had that. We had weather delays that lasted a full week for an Italian launch, not a national security launch, but just seeing that team keep that fragile satellite and that rocket on the pad while we kept scrubbing as the launch went on. So just a lot of issues. Probably my favorite one is we landed the X-37 out there. The first I was there for the first and third landing, deployed in the middle one for the second. And what a unique thing to not take uh, highly volatile, dangerous metal, if you will, or equipment away from a launch site into space, which is the point of launching. And now bringing, while it was smaller, we're still bringing something coming in fast towards the people, right? Towards the population, and we had to think differently. Great metaphor for life, but had to think differently about landing something versus launching something from using the same equipment and adapting the procedures. And I thought watching that team do that made us better launchers, for lack of a better label, while we did something unique, which was to bring something at us versus something away from us. So just lots of great stories. First Falcon 9 launch was out there and bringing in a different perspective on government support uh, to a supporting contracting agency challenged us in a good way. And so anyway, lots of good stories. But those are some quick ones that just speak to the riskiness that is the launch and frankly landing mission.
Yes, sir. Very important work, and very interesting about the X-37, how you were there when you saw the development of that capability. And then you talk about your deployment. So during your tenure as Director of Space Forces for CENTCOM, you helped integrate satellite communications, missile warning, and GPS into real-time operations. Can you walk us through a mission where space capabilities truly change the outcome?
Yeah, a couple of them. I had a chance to deploy, but even before I was the director of Space Forces later in my career, deploy right after 9/11 as a young captain in 2001. And we watched, it seems probably uh, not old fashioned, but sort of dated now, but we were putting combat track and the ability to frankly just send text into cargo planes, but we adapted that for the B-2. So on October 7th, when we dropped bombs after 9/11 in Afghanistan, they took off from Missouri, 36 hours previously. And so using space, we were able in their stealth mode as far as emitting energy, ability to take in just the targeting, the GPS coordinates for their JDAMs on board for that initial launch. And so doing that en route when the ATO had come out or wasn't even going to come out yet, so they would have to get that targeting in flight, was just a unique thing to bring space capabilities there. Fast forward, we use CSAR to protect and save. Junker 1-4 was an F-14 that went down, not for combat. I lost an engine, but we had to pull the front seater and the pilot and the Rio back out of harm's way. So HH-60s did a phenomenal job doing that, but using space to locate them and be able to bring them back into safety was a huge win for a capability that we test and operate year round. And then to mention late in my career, going back and seeing again how things changed and how they didn't change 9 years later, near the end of OEF, uh, was neat to see how now we are in that offense defensive mode with Silent Sentry and protecting our very critical SATCOM satellite communications was I think important just to be a part of and watching that team and enabling that team doing what they were doing, whether it was interference, non-intentional, or nefarious activity that so many parts of the theater were reliant on satellite communications. We had the systems in place, the people in place to keep it protected. And so that was uh, just an honor to be a part of that whole team.
Sir, I use this example a lot when I tell a story. Um, where in my previous career, I also had the opportunity to speak with Coalition and Allied and the rest of our partners. And always we'd bring up I'd bring up the conversation. I'd have the question, hey, is space part of the minimum force package requirements? And for those of us listening, the minimum force package is the minimum capabilities you need for a successful mission for the entire package that's going to be, taken against a potential adversary. So I suspect what you're describing, you had to have that discussion on a regular basis, and you probably were provided a resounding yes. Space is critical to the minimum force package requirements.
Yeah, and you take it for granted. And I think all parts, sometimes our maintenance officers with aircraft are taken for granted, right? And so you've
Yeah.
got to make sure all the pieces are ready to go and exercised and trustworthy in a sense that they're ready to go when you need them as part of that, to use your terms, minimum force package.
Sir, there's a thing that changed the history of space operations, and that was Operation Burnt Frost in 2008. And you had a hand in that. And that was a mission to intercept a malfunctioning satellite. What were the key technical and organizational challenges? And what did that experience teach you about coordination between agencies and systems?
Yeah, so I had a chance. I was a squadron commander up at Cavalier Air Force Station, right? World's most capable radar. I'll put that plug out there. Uh, but what an interesting and historic mission to be a part of the whole missile warning and space surveillance network to enable that. Two key lessons I took away from that based on your question. One is the classification of it was interesting. We did not have skiffs an SCI level out at these sites like we do today. And that was at the time, even though it was our own satellite, but the mission itself was highly classified. Just the ability to not talk, right, and know what was at stake, and having not all the information inside friendly channels, if you will, because there wasn't an enemy involved here, right? It was our own malfunctioning satellite, was interesting and hampered our ability to do, I think, frankly, what we needed to do. And the story I remember thinking was we were going to bring the radar down for maintenance ahead of time. So we were ready to go once the intercept happened, so we could track all the debris and make sure we were up for the aftermath. Because of some classification and issues, we didn't have full awareness of the whole plan and didn't realize how we ourselves were critical to the final orbit refinement calculations on the last two remaining orbits before it came back around over the Pacific to be shot down for the targeting solution. And so we could have made, thankfully, we had no negative impact, but I look back on that and realized that had we had full knowledge, we could have put less risk into the calculus uh, by knowing what was happening on the front end, not just thinking we were on the back end. And then on the technology side, just never having had to collect that much debris, knowing that it would be occurring, would we, with the capability of our radar, be able to capture that? And we had to modify our crew system. Instead of a two-person crew, we had four people with brought in an extra console. So exciting times to practice and get ready for something that we frankly weren't designed to do, were the technological and organizational challenges, not just the classification one I mentioned up front.
Now, that is the basics of obviously your tremendous career, and we just kind of glossed over obviously the highlights of that career. Now let's talk about how that helped influence your current trajectory and getting into academia. So there's some exciting things you're working on, and one of them is how you got your doctoral research and the fact that you titled it Space Operations Education Research, studying undergraduate experiences as predictors of early career performance for military space operations officers. What motivated you to study this topic?
Uh, yeah, so I was the ROTC commander here at Clemson University, and General Cotton at the time was the Air University commander, and he put a call out to those of us in academia, again, trying to develop future officers, and just asked us to look beyond that mission and were there other capabilities on your campus that contribute maybe to technical research or otherwise. And based on my background and affinity at the time, but also a very unique department we have here at Clemson, where their education research for STEM research isn't a byproduct of the College of Education. It's actually an education department inside the College of Engineering, just a different organizational twist on that. And so my connection to them and my background allowed me to maybe go a little bit deeper into things that you and I saw, looked at, and written about in our careers, but not always the academic research rigor, which is not just do you need a STEM degree or not to be successful as a space operator, but I want to bring other data, other information into that discussion from a human subjects research as to what do we believe, what environment or what attributes of a person or the things they're exposed to the left of commissioning helps them be successful to the right of commissioning. And that was the crux of what started out as a small project that turned into a 5-year study at the end of what had been about a 35-year legacy selection and training model until we had the recent changes about 2 years ago with the Space Force changes that happened.
It's very interesting. And yeah, we can sit here and have the discussion about the motivation, but it's real simple. All you have to do is live it for 40 years, and that's motivation enough,
Yeah. Like
which
they
is
say
what
in
exactly
academia,
what you did.
yeah. No, just it's a chance. We don't have a lot of space operators in academia. It's
Yeah.
just like all of life. You help translate, help add context, uh,
Yeah.
and impact it where you can.
And what I really like about the study is it draws on theoretical frameworks like human capital theory, credentialism, and social cognitive career theory. How did these theories inform your research design, and why did you choose them?
Yeah, so all research is based on some framework, unless you're trying to develop a new one, which was not the focus. I was trying to adapt it to a new, in this case, industry, space operations. But human capital theory just talks about, hey, the more you pump into training and education, that should lead to more productivity for a company or an industry or more earnings for an individual. But it's got a dark side to it, that credentialism theory that says sometimes we focus on the credential, right? The certification, the commission in our language, the major that you earn, and that may not always be indicative of the underlying knowledge or skills or capabilities that individual has. It's certainly indicative of persistence in an academic environment. They have to have success, but it may not be always representative of what you want to bring into an industry or in this case a career field afterwards. And so social cognitive career theory kind of adds other human elements to that, that individual's motivation, their opportunities, not just the credentials they came with, which historically in the way we selected space officers, which is did you earn a commission? And ROTC is a great program. It comes with skills, but it doesn't always necessarily measure the things that will make you successful, at least as a space operator, certainly as an officer. And then your major may or may not connect, right? Just because you were in the classroom and excelled in that environment and were persistent does not always bring with it that PowerPoint slide you heard from the instructor or that activity you worked on, right, into what you need in an operational sense. So the point was trying to find a correlation or relationship between using those theories between what happens in your undergraduate years, again, to the left of commissioning, and how does that may map to success or otherwise in the early part of your career before other influences start impacting your success mid-level and beyond.
Thank you for that. And part of the study is you analyzed newly commissioned Air Force and Space Force space operations officers from 2018 to 2022, looking at their undergraduate experiences and how those relate to early career performance. What were the variables you focused on, and what stood out most in your findings?
Yeah, so we want to look at a lot, right? And then we had to whittle down to just what was frankly readily available and able to be provided by initially the Air Force and then the Space Force after they had stood up. But we looked at, of course, major commissioning source. We looked at some demographics like race, gender, things, just because it was available and part of the discussion. The kind of school they went to, certainly the academy and other selective schools or not. Were they prior enlisted? There's a list of about 15 markers that we wanted to pull together to see if we could find any relationship between that and success early in the career. And early in the career, we had three markers. We're a very structured organization in the military. And so, unlike some other industries, lawyers, doctors, and whatnot, we've got some fairly potentially could have been convenient markers for how well you do it at undergraduate space training. I know that's changed, but at the time that was the training school. Uh, and then what we do at operational training after that with uh, training that occurs at the 319th. And then we also have operational training and certifications you have at the units. Unfortunately, due to limitations we could spend some time on in the military, all that data it's available out there somewhere, but the databases, the contract limitations, the distractions for other priorities that the community have wasn't necessarily available for the research we were doing here at Clemson. What was available was UST uh, data and how well they're doing it. Still a training environment, not quite operational, but that was how the Air Force and then Space Force were certifying space operators. So it was a good industry, early career industry metric to use on the as a dependent variable, if you will. I could talk
It's
about findings if you like.
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask you that one finding was that undergraduate major, often used for career field selection, did not show significance as a predictor of early performance, which is surprising. What does this suggest about how we should think about recruiting and training space operations officers?
Yeah, so part of that led to just the function of UST, which again has changed now with a new course out in Colorado Springs. But at the time, it really spoke to, are we overtraining? Excuse me, are we overeducating those coming in? Or are we undertraining them at UST? Because the major didn't matter whether you were non-STEM or STEM. There was a slight statistical significance, but not a meaningful one, meaning you could see some of the numbers change. But as far as what it really meant was a difference in a couple of percentage points. It wasn't going to wash you out of UST. It wasn't going to really reduce your grade, so to speak, or your lack of performance in that environment. And so it became inconsequential in the certifying training course that existed, obviously, for decades, or at least measured over these 5 years. And so we looked at other things that contributed. I think it stems more, this is my personal opinion, but I just think we're not leveraging that major in that environment and the rigor of UST, not to fail people out, but we could have trained harder, if you will. And I think the new course is doing that, preparing them more so when they graduate from that initial training environment, they're more capable because of that training. The other implication for major is maybe it's a better marker later on in your career if we had some of those other um, professional career performance markers. You might start to see that correlation to major. It just wasn't consequential to becoming a certified space operator uh, through the research, at least.
Yeah, and now let's talk about GPA. I'm glad that my selection to start my career in the Air Force didn't rely on my GPA because it wasn't all that great. But let's talk about how you found that GPA, officer aptitude, and race had statistical significance, but low practical significance. Can you explain
Yeah,
the difference between statistical and practical significance and why it
sure. So
matters as
one,
this kind of research?
yeah, sorry. So one of them is just when you're trying to find a relationship is can the math show that there is a variability in your dependent variable, in this case, how well do you do at UST, based on some independent marker or variable feeding it. And so we had those 15 markers I mentioned earlier, variables on type of school you went to, GPA, the three you mentioned. The only three that came out with any statistical significance was GPA, how they scored on their Air Force officer qualifying test, right? An aptitude test. And then finally, race and maybe the way you weren't thinking about it. But those three had some statistical significance. But if you stitched them all together, it still did not have any meaningful change in how well they did in training, likely due to the lack of maybe rigor. And this I say maybe because that wasn't, we didn't, part of our research wasn't to evaluate UST, it was just to look at the results. Uh, but you could have a one GPA point higher than an officer sitting next to you. You could have 10 points higher than them on the AFOQT, and you could be a non-white, frankly, due to the model majority theory, if you've heard that, typically coming from uh, those with Asian descent. Uh, those three stitched together, if you were another officer that had those three positive markers compared to the other officer, it would still only equate to a slightly higher percentage in success at UST, but not meaningful. So statistically, they caused a variance, but there wasn't any certainly meaningfulness to it and how well they did. When you have almost a zero, and it frankly was a zero washout rate, a few block tests, individuals that were failed, but most people go through, likely due to great instruction at UST, but also maybe a lack of rigor in pushing the limits on what these graduates were coming out of their undergraduate years.
Now, based on your conclusions, you made several recommendations to improve recruiting, selection, training, and professional development for the U.S. Space Force. What are the top two or three recommendations you would highlight?
One is to, A, because the training's changed and they've made some changes of selection, is based on this study, some of the results don't directly equate to what's happening, but the procedures, the methodology, I think probably were the most important things we learned in the study. The data that was there but wasn't captured or packaged or conditioned in a way to do the trend analysis, frankly, at the headquarters level, or to be available for higher order research here at the PhD level in academia, is probably the biggest one. We had unstandardized ways the three commissioning sources collected some of the data on how well they were ranked in their respective commissioning sources, ethnicities and race. If not that that has to be the only thing we measure, but they are not, believe it or not, collect in a standardized fashion. How we articulate the majors change from a couple different databases, even among our own commissioning sources in the Air Force and Space Force as part of the Department of the Air Force. So there's some overlap there. And so capturing it correctly in a way that also allows it to be studied comes comes back to the priority that should be placed, in my opinion, on what we can do to then drive data-driven decisions on who we're selecting and maybe how we change training or other things early in their career. And the second, last thing I'll just kind of mention too is there's other things we should chase because of some of those theories we mentioned earlier that aren't as convenient to measure, but maybe more important. Can we find academia has ways to measure this, but that individual's officer's motivation for the career field, even the way we get their preferences are different across the three commissioning sources, which surprised me. What's really their number one? Do they want to be in space or not? And where was it on their list? But how do you measure the motivation? What opportunities do they have for a summer program or mentors did they have at their university that maybe came from space operations? Could all be things that help drive their success earlier in their careers, not necessarily their GPA, their major, and some of these demographic markers.
It is fascinating because there's so much opportunity here based on this initial study that's starting to dissect the process a bit and really help to create a paradigm shift that we can start to look at adapting to bring in the highest capable and retain the best possible talent. So, for those listeners involved in education, training, or leadership development, what broader lessons from your research apply beyond the military space community?
Uh, I think working together, right? We use terms like S1 for personnelists, the training environment, the ops environment, which even on the operations side, they've got a training and certification process beyond education and training. But those three elements inside an organization or the equivalents in other career fields, per your question, finding them how to work together because sometimes they get stovepiped uh, would help immensely, right? And that's hard to overcome some of those cultural differences. And then certainly working with academia, whether you have the capability like Clemson has or people that speak that language back in different parts of academia, could help apply research to it, human subjects research, not technical research, but human subjects research to give them information back in ways that they can help shape, right, in the studies they want to do to go after a recruiting policy, maybe a training curriculum, maybe a selection process down at the personnel center that could be informed, or just different ways we can help capture information, like when they enter their initial training, right? What can we ask them about their undergraduate experience and get that human quality information from them, not just the quantity data we get off their records, like GPA, what kind of school they went to. All that can come together to help us study it, of course, do quick trend analysis at the headquarters level, but do some deep dive studying beyond the articles you see published every so often, uh, and help really affect policy change for the better, right? Continuous improvement is all you're really hoping for there.
Colonel Balts, I'm going to switch now to this new journey that you're on and your new mission here at Clemson University, teaching in the College of Business. What's been the biggest surprise or adjustment about stepping into academia after decades in uniform?
That's awesome. Well, there's good and bad, right? Or I should say familiar and different is probably a better way to say it. Uh, a campus feels like a base, right? It's got all the elements. I may not live on the campus per se, like late in my career living on a base, uh, but there's different elements coming together, right? The infrastructure of the base, the mission on campus, of course, is academic, sometimes athletics and other things versus a launch mission or different military mission on a base. So that part felt very familiar, and the campus I'm on is very military friendly, so there's a great camaraderie and component that part of the component to it as well. The difference is the culture, right? Not just the missions are different, of course, just because the physical layout feels familiar, but it's they're more risk adverse, right, in academia, and there may be reasons for that. It's just not what we come to know and the way we were raised in at least my first profession. Uh, the values are sometimes different, right? My cadets, when I was an ROTC commander, what we saw in the military, we're not perfect, but we put a strong emphasis on integrity, our honor code, and whatnot. And at all campuses, not just Clemson, the civilian students, for lack of a better label, are still struggling with that because of the values they come out of their under or their K through 12 environment and don't have the rigor we have at basic training and officer training to help instill a different set of values. So the universities still try to do that. I think we just have a better mechanism for that, and therefore I feel a different value system among the students here than I would among, let's say, young airmen. So there's some of those differences. It's still a great environment to be a part of, and airmen kept us young and/or made us feel old. The students keep us young and/or make us feel old, but great environment, especially here at Clemson. We've got a phenomenal military-friendly environment. I won't try to sell you on that, but it's a good place to be.
And so we've heard numerous times from the Chief of Space Operations, number one, General Retired Jay Raymond, who used to talk about Clemson on a regular basis. So, yeah, everyone I think is a fan of Clemson and all the work that you're doing down there. In the military, especially in space operations, sometimes the environment can be risk averse by nature. We can't handle too many mistakes. So, how did you cultivate innovation and creative problem solving within your units?
I think you just want to create a safe space for it, right? That you gotta know when you should be conscious about the risks you're taking and not just be flying off the seat of your pants, so to speak, and going into a direction. Know what risks you're taking. I frankly, I don't think I discovered that until late in my career in the launch business because we have a very methodical way to measure or do our best job to measure and understand the risks of that very important 7 minutes leading, of launch, never mind what leads up to it. And so translating that into other environments in the military and certainly now in academia, trying to instill that into my students, uh, find a way to enable that, experiment in a safe space, be okay with the risks you take when they manifest themselves once in a while or when it kicks in, not punish that, so to speak, or find a way to incentivize it. So it's easier said than done, of course, but that mindset, that shift is helpful, I think, because it takes you at a personal growth to the next level. Never mind what you're trying to do for your unit or a mission or the industry in general.
For young people dreaming of careers in space, defense, or leadership, what mindset or skill do you think matters most for long-term success?
Hmm. We just talked about risk, so embrace risk. I think our generation was that one that became more risk adverse, I think, and so my little part of the world, and I think from what you said, you too, try to change that calculus. Uh, Also focus on trust. How do you earn trust? How do you trust others? And I don't mean from the purest integrity sense. I also mean from are you preparing? Are you studying? Are you reliable? How do you communicate? All those things that help earn trust of others and that you should trust in others that allow you to take those risks that we just talked about. So I think that's important. And then maybe because the way I was brought up in my childhood and organizations like scouting and certainly through the military, that last thing is to really exemplify selflessness, right? Not self-zero. You don't have to be a martyr, but to understand that your life may be about you, but it's not for you. And so, what are you doing with what's been given to you, or what you can create for a higher purpose, like the military, in academia, or whatever your profession may be? I think that focus, it's hard because so much of K through 12 in your childhood is being catered to you. And I see that shift in the undergraduate years and probably for all of us in our early 20s to realizing that, hey, I'm out here to help others directly or just be a part of a larger team and get out of my own head, so to speak, in my own heart and focus elsewhere, I think is an important transition we all should make. Some people make it a lot earlier than I did, and I'm still struggling with that, but that's an important piece of it too.
Colonel, thank you for that. And as we close out, I'm just curious, just from your perspective, you see this next generation of folks growing up and creating career opportunities and getting involved in different careers. From your perspective, how are you seeing this next generation evolve just based on the technological advancements, the introduction of artificial intelligence versus actual intelligence? And, what is their outlook now as they look at their futures? And just provide a brief perspective on that again, from your point of view.
Yeah, so much things are changing fast. There's so much available to them, right? Especially with AI, things doing for them, not just the information internet coming at them. And so without experience, the context of all that is, I think, where we see the anxiety building, right? Because they can get more access in the past than we had because of those technological advancements. And so giving them opportunities, and I'm seeing that in academia. The traditional classroom is changing. I run a very highly experiential program, right? Practicums, if you will, not lecture instruction, because they need to grab experience through gaming, through a practicum, clinicals, those kinds of things, through things like ROTC or internships to help when they get all this information or ask AI to do some of it for them, the right things for them. They start to understand the context and the priorities and where it can fit in, because otherwise it's just a lot of quantity, but isn't always shaped the right direction. And so they need to feel that. We all need to feel that. You can't take a pill to earn that. And so they got to get that experience somehow. We can speed that experience a bunch of different ways, but that's the part I see. And academia is flexing to help that. Individuals should certainly strive for that. And that I think will help them put it all into perspective and then do the next great thing for our nation or for society after that.
Sir, truly a selfless leader. I really appreciate your time today. Colonel Balts, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your experiences, your research, your insights. Your journey from Air Force operations to academia and your dedication to preparing the next generation of space professionals is truly inspiring. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Space Power Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and follow the Space Force Association as we continue exploring the ideas and people advancing America's space power. We'll put a link to Dr. Baltz's research here in the description so you can reference it. And until next time, Semper Supra, keep looking up and stay curious.
We make it clear.